Afternoon. My name is Detlef Gericke-Schönhagen and I'm the director of the Goethe Institute. In December, the international community of states will meet in Copenhagen, Denmark, to negotiate a post-Kyoto international climate agreement. Many observers see the Copenhagen negotiation as a last chance to prevent dangerous climate changes. In anticipation of this event, which is of high significance for nothing less than the whole mankind, we are proud to present two researchers who deeply influence the debate on this issue in the respective sides of the Atlantic, Professor Robert Stavins and Professor Claus Leggewie. Today we have two lectures. Professor Stavins and Professor Leggewie will present their respective views on the requirements of a post-Kyoto international climate agreement. This will be followed by a question-and-answer session and be finished by a reception to which you are all welcome. Tomorrow at 9 a.m. we will continue and deepen our discussion in a closed-door workshop and focus on aspects such as international climate governance and the formulas for emission targets and technological possibilities for decarbonating our economies. The symposium is part of Climate Culture, a joint project of the Goethe Institute and the Institute for Advanced Study in Humanities in Essen, Germany, taking place in 4 cities: Montreal, Boston, San Francisco, and Mexico City. Here in Boston, I'm very happy to have the support and the partnership of the Center for European Studies. Thank you, Treasurer Craig. Second, I'm especially glad that we could put together an excellent combination of distinguished senior experts and young and promising researchers from both sides of the Atlantic, from the USA, from Canada, from Mexico, and from France. Thank you very much, and please enjoy our symposium. Now I will hand over the floor to our moderator, Eloi Laurent, who will introduce our speakers and the topic in more detail. Eloi Laurent is a French-born visiting scholar of the Minda Gunzburg Center for European Studies. S'il vous plaît, Eloi.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Good afternoon. It is a privilege for me to moderate this superb conference. Let me say a few words on the context of this conference before I yield the floor to the speakers. We are fast approaching, as you know, the crucial Copenhagen summit in early December, and I think there is some good news and some bad news. I will start with the good news. The good news is that because of the global recession and the ensuing sharp fall in green gas emissions, the parties to the Kyoto Protocol have most likely in 2009 reduced their emission by more than 5% compared to the base year of the protocol. And if you look at recent data from the IEA, you have a confirmation of this trend. In other words, the Kyoto Protocol, which is always described as a total failure, is actually a success in the respect that its overall target actually has been reached in the time frame 2008-2012. Yet, the bad news is threefold. We have 3 problems. First, directly related to the good news is that the Kyoto performance is nowhere near what we should be doing if we want to avoid the most catastrophic consequences of climate change. So yes, we have reached this target, but no, it's absolutely not enough. The second bad news is there's a new wave of climate skepticism. Actually, it's very old arguments most of the time, but there is a new strength. Sometimes it's pure and simple denial. Climate change doesn't exist. So we are back 20 years ago. Most of the time, though, it's more subtle. It lies in convincing public opinions that we don't need any political constraint, we don't need any economic instrument, we don't need any cultural shift that technology will do. I call this the vacuum cleaner hypothesis. The hypothesis that someone somewhere will just build a gigantic vacuum cleaner that will take away all this carbon dioxide, and we can just get back to our business as usual. Most likely, this will not happen, so we need to think hard about what we should be doing. Finally, and more importantly, I think, The third problem is that global negotiations in different forums seem to be in a deadlock, as we saw just yesterday in London and today actually also. I think this is because of a crisis of credibility. A crisis of credibility of developed countries, a crisis of credibility on the mitigation front, and a crisis of credibility on the adaptation front. Because of this crisis of credibility, many voices now try to lower expectations for Copenhagen, and some even try to refocus the debate on the US-China bilateral relation. I believe it's the wrong way to go. I think we need an ambition agreement and we need a global agreement. So in this respect, it is really hard to overstate the importance of the US and the EU positions and propositions in global negotiations. So to help us understand the critical elements and the key trade-offs of a possible agreement and how the US and the EU can push for, and I quote, a scientifically sound, economically rational, and politically pragmatic post-Kyoto framework, we are fortunate today to have two very distinguished speakers. First, directly to my right, Claus Leggewie. Professor Leggewie is director of the Institute of Advanced Study in the Humanities in Essen. He's also an appointed member of the German Advisory Council on Global Change to the federal government. As such, he's a key actor of the EU climate strategy. As you may know, the EU is an example for the rest of the world in terms of climate leadership, and Germany is a leader within the EU. So the question is the EU able to overcome the logic of global public action, the problem of public action at the global level, and just translate in the global arena this regional exemplarity? Robert Stavins is a professor of business and government here at Harvard Kennedy School. Professor Stavins heads the Harvard project on international climate agreements that brings together the best of academia, business, governments, and NGOs to design the global climate policy of the future. The project has put out many papers and that are, of course, all available on the website, and two books, the latest of which is Post-Kyoto International Climate Policy, that was out at Cambridge University Press just this year, and of course it's directly relevant to this conference. I should maybe clarify that from the onset that both speakers are not here today in any official capacity for the US or European Union government. So that said, each speaker will have 30 minutes and then we can go to Q&A. I would just like to, before we start, I would like to thank the sponsors of this important event. The Goethe Institute in Boston, the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities in Essen, the Harvard Center for the Environment and Natural Resources Program at the Belfast Center here at Harvard, and of course, our very own Center for European Studies. And with that, Professor Leggewie, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for this warm welcome. First of all, let me thank you for the weather. When we flew in yesterday night, the captain was telling us, that was it with Indian summer. He was wrong. Thank you very much for that. And secondly, you can imagine how happy I am here to be here, because I was here like 30 years ago as a young assistant professor from Göttingen at that time. And today I remembered what I was talking about at that particular event in this particular lower conference hall. It was about a comparison between the ecological movements in France and Germany. So what you see here is Jan Vermeer, a painting that is in the Städel Museum in Frankfurt. It's like 20 to 20 inches, and it shows the geographer. It was painted in the late 17th century. I put this painting in front of you because it shows the geographer of his time at work. And originally, we know from the radiation of the canvas, originally the man was showing, look down at the table. And Vermeer has changed it, and the man is now looking out of the window in a very ambiguous manner. He is now a much more dynamic stature, and he's in the sunlight, and he is, if you like, the image or the representative of a scientist of his time. And this is why I put this painting in front of you, because I think that this man is observing and reflecting a great transformation that was going on in the early years of modernity, particularly in the Pays-Bas, the Netherlands, in this particular time. And I think what he is showing us is a kind of the appropriation of the modern world. Look at the sea chart, where you see the emerging Dutch Empire based on mercantile and commercial efforts, not just on territorial efforts. You see the globe, you see the square, you see the cross, etc. This is what, if you like, the Google Earth equipment of the late 17th century, and that's why I was giving you this picture. The title that I chose for this presentation needs probably some explanation. I'm talking about German Angst. We are talking about natural boundaries and about American optimism, because Americans mostly think in terms of open frontiers and trying to catch up with a problematic situation. And that may be an interesting combination for a transatlantic perspective on the problems Mr. Laurent was already stating here in a very good manner. Political action is under certain natural boundaries now, concerning resources, concerning climate change, and it's under a very rigid time frame. We have, in our opinion, just 5 or 10 years for political actions. That is like 2 legislatures, Germany, or another presidency of Barack Obama. Here again, we would need a combination of the respect for this time frame and natural boundaries, as well as some optimism based on technologies, but also on civil society action. And Al Gore was hinting at a kind of renewed Apollo program for solving the climate crisis. So what we see now is more of a human environment interface, interaction, more than the geography of his time. Let me very briefly present the institute where I come from. You see the picture there. This is the Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities in Essen. We set up a program, and partly in common with the Goethe Institute, I'm very grateful for that, on what we call Klimakultur, the culture of climate. And our approach is from the humanities and the cultural studies, and it's dealing with the cultural paradigms of climate change. Today, I'm more here as a political scientist, but we'll come back to this issue later in my presentation. What we should know is, maybe can be seen on this particular slide. You were talking about the renaissance of a certain skepticism, but I think this is quite clear. The atmospheric CO2 concentration is rising as a result of anthropogenic emissions since pre-industrial era. We're now at about 384 ppm. If we continue with business as usual, that means warming by 2001 of 3 or even 7 degrees Celsius. And
2001, you mean 2100?
Yeah. Excuse me, yeah. Sure, 2100. And the 2 degrees Celsius goal or limit that is was proposed by the Global Change Council in 1995 is to avoid extreme weather events, further loss of biodiversity, the acidification of oceans, and the sea level rises. We are, this advisory council is arguing that, transcending the 2 degrees goal would have catastrophic consequences. One of them can be seen here. That's what we can expect. You see, this is also based on observations from 1970 to 2010. about sea level change relative to 1990. We're now heading to a further sea level change, which might be very catastrophic even in the near future in 2100. Maybe you remember that in June 2009 on the Solomon Islands, a future has already begun, and the refugees from the Solomon Islands are having now a refugee status in Indonesia officially. And if we take, and that will be one of the, let's say, inspirations that I had for my work in the Global Advisory Council, we should take the standpoint of the so-called AOSIS countries. This is a coalition of 15 small island and low-lying countries, including Malta and Cyprus from the European Union, who propose an even more ambitious goal or limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius. It might be worse. What you see here is some observations about the Arctic sea ice extent. We already have a very important difference from what the mean and range of IPCC models were giving since the late 1970s and 80s. And here you see the observations, which can also be visualized in this picture from '79 and the other one from 2007. You really can observe the melting of the Arctic ice in this picture. Three major challenges are lying before us. One is the destabilization of the Earth system. What we see here is the so-called tipping points, with the instability of the Greenland ice sheet, the weakening of the North Atlantic current, the collapse of Amazonian forest, and the instability of the West Antarctic ice sheet, and the monsoon transformation in Asia. And these are five of a dozen of possible tipping points where the destabilization of Earth system might become uncontrollable. The next one is what Nick Stern called the greatest marked failure in terms of climate change. And what we are dealing with now in terms of global governance is the state failure, and you were already addressing the questions at the table in Copenhagen. And here is a picture that is given us by the art department of the NASA art department, showing the danger of an asteroid hitting the globe. There is a new article by an colleague from Texas Tech who was arguing that the extinction of the dinosaurs 150 million years ago was happening because an asteroid was hitting the Gulf of Mexico in that period. Why I'm showing this picture, I'm not saying that we are in danger of a next asteroid, but I would simply raise the question that is a permanent issue for the game theory, what kind of dilemmas we are in, not coming to terms with a certain political conclusion or political action on the basis of the insights about dangerous climate change. You are all aware about the prisoner's dilemma in game theory. That means that two people acting rationally are producing an apparently irrational result in not cooperating. And the question exactly is, for Copenhagen, why cooperate, and under what circumstances are we forced to cooperate more than we're doing right now? Scott Barrett wrote a book about this, Why Cooperate, and he rejected the analogy of an asteroid hitting the globe and was saying that still climate change and climate policy has room enough for arguing on the international level in terms of advantages, for example, given Russia, and heavy and catastrophic losses, for example, the Solomon Islands. And there is still no common view about the upcoming climate crisis. The problem then is, how do we secure public goods on a world scale? We are faced with another example of the tragedy of the commons, and here is exactly where the German Advisory Council on Global Change stepped in with a proposal. This goes back to the 2 degrees limit, or goal as it is sometimes sent, from 1995. This was taken over by the declaration of the leaders of the major economies forum on energy and climate in July 2009, and as the leaders of G8 and G20 in conferences during this years, and they acknowledge, we recognize the broad scientific view that the increase in global average temperature above pre-industrial levels ought not to exceed 2 degrees Celsius. This is very interesting. If the leaders of the leading industrial and newly industrialized countries take over this position, but the consequences that they face may not be known to them. First of all, it's a huge and ambitious goal, and there is no implementation or operationalization for this particular goal on the table. That's why the German Advisory Council put forward the budget approach. There are a couple of inspirations for this budget approach during the last decade. A lot of people were thinking about a budget approach for solving the climate crisis. And here's even a very optimistic title for this, from carbon insolvency to climate dividend, and it's exactly what this budget approach would put on the table. First of all, the budget approach is to acknowledge the 2 degrees limit on a legally binding basis. This is what creates, of course, nervous reactions in the United States. How can we have an internationally binding goal? Second is a global CO2 budget until 2050, acknowledging that the peak year for every nation state must be reached between 2015 and 2020. You remember that the Indian Prime Minister Singh was arguing with German Chancellor Angela Merkel about how far the newly industrialized countries should go, and he was arguing, well, we will never exceed what you diminish. So in a way, this was a very refined answer, and it's exactly what it can be shown here. If Germany or the EU would keep to the peak year 2015, and this means the EU in general, then of course India might not exceed this peak on its own basis.
On a per capita basis?
I'm coming to this point exactly. The next point is the distribution of emission rights among the world's population on an equal per capita basis for national budgets. So the budgets can be formulated on a national level. It must have verifiable national decarbonization roadmaps. This is, of course, the sovereignty of any nation state participating in this international treaty to have its own roadmaps based on whatever nuclear power, carbon capture and storage, or even the focus on renewable energies. Countries with high per capita emissions, which also include China now, agree upon reduction commitments up to 2020. And this is, of course, the next hard question for a cooperation with the United States and China, and is exactly what probably will not be reached in Copenhagen. We also were talking about the establishment of a World Climate Bank based or organizing a generalized emissions trade system. Emissions trade in world scale is very underdeveloped and fragmented and ambiguous. Of course, this system would need a generalized emissions trade system, much tougher than the one that is currently in place, and the establishment of what we call the World Climate Bank. This is the world as we knew it. You have here the most recent results of the Climate Change Performance Index 2009 by the CCPI, and it shows those who have very poor performances and those who have good or very good performances. And you see the countries that are not even listed here, who are not included in the assessment. This is the world as we knew it. You see where the big polluters are, including, of course, the European Union. And you see where you have some prospects for change. And the budget approach will change this worldview completely, because it shows exactly in those regions that were not even listed or for assessment, that they have a great potential for a global climate deal. We have kind of shown we have a new, this world map shows 3 groups of countries. The countries with per capita emissions above 5.4 tons, those in the middle between 2.7 and 5.4, and those countries with per capita emissions below 2.7. And the chances for those with very low per capita emissions are the highest. You see here, again, the sense of urgency that is on the table in Copenhagen. If ever we would postpone the reference year, the base year, or we would postpone the peak year for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, particularly CO2, the efforts, that is the reduction rate per year, is becoming steeper and steeper. You see what the efforts should be if we all would agree upon a reduction rate starting in 2011. That would mean from the goal in 2050, seen sort of backward from the zero emission goal in 2050, that we would have a yearly reduction of 3.7%, which is very ambitious, which is unknown to any technological endeavor in the history of economy and societies. But you see how sharp and how steep reduction rates must be if we would postpone the peak to 2020. We have to talk about the ethical foundations for this budget approach. If we only take historical responsibility, look at Germany and US in this table, both countries are already carbon insolvent. Those climates would have to stop immediately the greenhouse gas emissions, which is, of course, impossible. This kind of shock therapy is, of course, what nobody can argue for. You see that China has, on the basis of our budget approach, again, 26 year for further emission of greenhouse gases. A country that is exemplary for Africa south of Sahara would have 2,810 years on per capita level, and others like the Maldives or Mexico you can see. Of course, global justice reckoning for a global deal would have to take into account not just the polluter pays principle, that is the historical responsibility of early industrialized countries, which is in a way the negotiation position of most of the poor countries in Copenhagen. It would also have to take into account the precautionary principle, which is argued in the UNFCCC treaty, and it creates more obligations for newly industrialized countries like China and others. And it should also include the principle of equality. That means a long-term convergence of per capita emission rates. You see, this is a combination of 3 ethical principles: historical responsibility, precautionary principle, and the principle of equality. And that's why we came to a per capita argument. Here is the way this changes the picture. If we talk about future responsibility, then Germany and the US would have a couple of more years for emission Other countries like China and Brazil wouldn't change their position, and others like India would have much more time based on universalized emissions trade. Here is the per capita emission passes without emissions trade for Group 1, Group 2, and Group 3. And this is the modification that is then put forward by the principle of future responsibility. That means for certain countries like Germany, the US, China, Brazil, but also take India here, which is a very important a country in this respect. The comparison between consumption to date until 2009 and the remaining budget from 2010 to 2050, always on a per capita basis. And this picture changes when we include future responsibility of others in this regard. So there is a certain budget, and but you see also the necessity of reducing the emissions of today in a very radical manner for the EU, for the US, and of course in the middle term also for China. But you see the chances that are given here for countries like Indonesia or India. I skip that. Here is the advantage for India. If India, in a generalized emissions trade system, would use its budget completely, it would raise emissions on a level of 3.5. If they would sell 1/3 of their budget, they could lower their emissions to a very interesting point at 2050. And here's exactly the chances, for example, for a cooperation between India and Germany, or between EU and India. The EU are simply buying emissions rights from India and are giving India the technological and financial means to kind of leapfrog a certain development and not even start with the carbon path of development. I come to my conclusion. We have 3 pillars of global climate action. One is, of course, a technology jump. It's, if you like, almost a Maoist vision of the great jump to the future with renewables and efficiency programs. You have, of course, global low-carbon regulation, which is combined with market incentives. That was a system that was demonstrated here in a very brief manner. And, of course, for us, very important is civil society participation to figure out what change agents we have for alternative lifestyles, for programs of sufficiency that would simply have to add to this ambitious state action and economic action and technological jump. That is what was the leaders of G20 or the enlarged G8 group in L'Aquila. You know, there was an earthquake, and they were meeting at the initiative of Silvio Berlusconi, not on a wonderful island of Sardinia, but here in the distracted city of L'Aquila. And you see the Palace of Governance here, which is kind of shattered. So the needs, and I here come to the German policies. This is was published today. It's a prognosis by the Prognos and Öko Institute in Germany, and it shows exactly the task ahead until 2050. You see this huge blue pillar showing emissions today and the steep reduction necessity to 2050, and you see the main polluters, which is, of course, individual mobility, industry, households and services, and this can then be operationalized for 2 aspects. The change from mostly fossil energy production to solar and other renewable energies, and of course the reduction in particular for individual mobility. I can, if you like, I can come to this in the discussion because I couldn't translate it because it's just published today. The main pillars are, of course, individual mobility, which has to change into e-mobility, industry with efficiency programs, private households, particularly in terms of insulation and dumping and other aspects, efficiency programs too, and of course intelligent networks. Here is what a low-carbon strategy 2050 for Germany would mean: a reduction of greenhouse gases from 40% to 2020 and 95% in 2050. Energy efficiency and productivity increases of average 2.6% per year. An increase of the share of renewables in primary energy production up to 75% in 2050. Here is again the main sectors of change and the main innovation areas. I put here CCS on this table. The German Advisory Council has a split opinion about this. Most of us are not in favor of CCS because we think it's not the appropriate measure in Germany. But of course, German industry is very much involved in CCS programs, for example, in China or India or even in the US. And of course, it cannot be neglected. Most interesting is, of course, the development of intelligent networks, probably in mobility sector, in housing sector. I thank you very much for your attention. You have here the address where you can download the whole report of the German Advisory Council and a book that is just published by a colleague of mine and myself in this fall, which will be translated by Polity Press and available for you in next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was absolutely perfect in terms of timing. Very thorough assessment of goals and targets. I think maybe we are going to move towards the question of instruments with Professor Stavins' presentation.
Thank you very much. Pleased to be here. First of all, I'm going to be sitting down, so those of you who are over here, if you'd like to look at my smiling face, I urge you to move over to the side. It's your choice. Forgive me for sitting down, but I was at a international climate change conference and injured my back, although you shouldn't feel sorry for me because it was in Paris, so it was delightful. Let me start by telling you a story. A few years ago, I was on a plane about ready to take off from Logan Airport, and before the plane took off, the gentleman next to me turned to me, and it was clear that he wanted to have a conversation. You may have noticed what I have noticed, and that is there are two kinds of people on airplanes: those who like to have conversations with perfect strangers, and then the rest of us. And so he was very much of the former group. I'm very much of the latter group. And he tried to start the conversation the way that is typical of Americans. He asked me what business I'm in, what do I do for a living? And I confess to you that I did something very foolish. I told the truth. And I said, I'm an environmental economist. And he looked at me. He didn't say anything. And I looked at him. We looked into each other's eyes for quite a while. And here was this man who wanted so much to have a conversation, but he wasn't following up. And then it finally dawned upon me that the reason that he wasn't was that he had concluded that he had just met a living, breathing oxymoron, an internal contradiction. After all, it's either economics or the environment, and therefore it made no sense, and how could he talk? And I wasn't about to help him. But I will help you. And that is, not only is environmental economics not oxymoronic, but it's absolutely essential. I didn't say it's helpful. I said it's absolutely essential to an understanding of the nature of environmental problems in market economies, which are the kind of economies we now have in virtually all the countries of the world. And that's because the causes of environmental problems are economic, and environmental problems, including climate change, have important economic dimensions. So that suggests that an economic perspective is going to be helpful in understanding the problems and therefore designing solutions which are effective, are sensible economically, and hence are politically pragmatic, and we may actually see enacted and implemented as opposed to only the subject of books and discussion. So that's my justification, one of my justifications for taking an economic perspective with you this afternoon. Of course, my real justification is that I'm an economist and I don't have the capacity to take any other approach with you. Now, the approach I take is not going to be exclusively economic. I'll draw in a bit from political science, international relations, and legal scholarship, but it's largely going to be an economic approach. I want to start with the reality that concerns about global climate change have gone mainstream, even in the United States, which is a fact that's not often recognized on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. If that wasn't obvious from the 2006 cover story in Time magazine, it's even more striking from that there was a cover story in 2007 in Sports Illustrated. Now, both of those stories were full of errors, terribly misleading, but that's not my point. My point is that they demonstrate the fact that concerns are now widespread and mainstream. Very mainstream. We've witnessed in this country anyway what is fair to say probably is the galvanizing effect of former Vice President Gore's award-winning movie. Now, from an economic and indeed more broadly from a policy perspective, that film is terribly incomplete and hence misleading because it ignores the inconvenient truth that addressing climate change is going to be costly. In the United States, for example, addressing even the very unambitious short-term goals of the Kyoto Protocol would cost about the same as all firms complying with all other federal environmental regulations combined. That's our 6 major environmental statutes. Now, that doesn't mean the Great Depression, but it's a significant cost. That doesn't mean it's a bad idea to take action, but what does it mean? It means that it's a good idea to recognize these costs, think about these costs, think about how different policies to achieve the same goal will involve different costs if we're going to dissolve a domestic policy and indeed, my focus, an international policy arrangement that is going to be environmentally effective, is going to be economically rational, and therefore politically feasible. So my main topic is going to be the international domain of the post-Kyoto regime. I will say a bit of a word about U.S. climate policy, but only in terms of how the timing of what's happening in Washington links in with the challenges we face globally, and then I'll wrap up by saying something about the path ahead. So, as you know, the Kyoto Protocol came into force in 2005 without U.S. participation. We signed it, but we did not ratify the agreement. The direct effects of climate change will be trivial at best. They're lost in the noise, essentially, of the variants. You can't possibly see them. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that scientific evidence and economic analysis now point to the wisdom for a credible international approach. And I want to focus on that word international because, as was just elaborated on by the professor, this is a global commons problem. The greenhouse gases uniformly mix in the atmosphere. That means that the benefits for any individual country taking action, any country, will inevitably be less than the cost of taking action. And of course, that's the prescription for a free rider problem. That's the argument for international cooperation in this realm. The question is whether or not the Kyoto Protocol, its structure, if not its mild ambition, can provide the way forward. Well, the Kyoto Protocol has been criticized, particularly by economists such as myself, because first of all, given the design of it, the costs are much greater than they need to be due to the exclusion of developing countries. Conservative estimates say that the costs to achieve what's achieved are about 4 times greater than would be the cost-effective level. Also, the protocol achieves only trivial climate benefits, as I said, and fails to provide a long-term solution for what is a stock, not a flow, environmental problem. Third, it is ironic that what I've characterized as insufficient short-term targets are, in a sense, excessively ambitious. And that's because of the Kyoto Protocol's base year of 1990 and then the schedule of action of 2008 to 2012. This is, of course, particularly the case for the United States. And so I'd like to explain something to you that maybe you know about, but maybe you don't, about the legitimate difference in perspective between Europe and the United States on the Kyoto Protocol, which has absolutely nothing to do with political parties. It's not former President Bush, it's Clinton and Kerry and Gore just as much. There's a significant difference economically. And that is the base year of 1990. Something happened in the world, several things after that base year of 1990. So remember, all your emissions reductions, an unambitious 7% for the United States and an ambitious 8% for the European Union as a whole under its bubble in the protocol, are relative to your emissions in 1990. Subsequent to 1990, over that ensuing decade, the United States enjoyed a period of unparalleled economic growth. It was not happening in Europe. It was not happening in Canada. It was not happening in Japan or even Australia or New Zealand and the other countries in the industrialized world. Our GDP increased by 35%. And although our economy, like all industrialized economies in the world, has been becoming less carbon intensive for 35 years for reasons that have nothing to do with climate change policy, but the price of energy, nevertheless, that means a very substantial increase in CO2 emissions. And so that 7% target for the United States turns out to be a 30% reduction target when you get to 2008 to 2012. Well, what about in Europe? No, there wasn't the same economic growth, but there were some major upheavals post-1990. One of them was something that we all applaud, and it was the fall of the wall, which brought about German reunification. And as a result of German reunification, that means that the target for unified Germany includes the exceptionally generous emissions, the huge emissions of the former East Germany, all that inefficient carbon-belching industry, which subsequently closed down, resulting in economic recession in the East, migration, and all the other sad circumstances that led to for a period of time. But that's not the end of the story. Also in the United Kingdom, in the Thatcher years, for reasons that certainly have nothing to do with climate change, decision was made to privatize British coal. Privatizing British coal then took away the subsidies. We saw the movement in terms of dispatch for electricity generation and subsequently for investment in new capacity from coal in the United Kingdom to natural gas. Coincident of that was opening up North Sea gas, which also led to that movement. So the United Kingdom also had this wonderful headroom. Now let's add to that the country of France, which depends upon nuclear power for 85% of its electricity generation. You put those together and you combine it with the sincere and real far northern European emissions reductions, where those countries truly are very ambitious on this and other environmental regimes. And there are real reasons why there are legitimate differences in perspective between the other side of the Atlantic Ocean and this side of the Atlantic Ocean in terms of the Kyoto Protocol and what the cost would have been of achieving it. So on the one hand, I said it's not ambitious enough. It's not. Those reductions are very small. But it tries to accomplish them too fast. And that's why the phrase that I use to describe it is that it's too little, too fast, which is an unfortunate combination for any public policy. It's as if you wanted to design a vehicle to get you efficiently and sustainably to New York, and you spent all of your time, we sat down in a group, we spent all of our time talking about how fast would it go in the first 100 meters. Well, you know what you're going to design is a drag racer, and it's not going to get you from here to New York. It's going to go very fast and it's going to burn out. So that's the problem with that short time horizon. On the other hand, there are some positive things about the Kyoto Protocol. It has some market-based instruments built into it, although in a very flawed way. They won't really operate. It has the appearance of fairness. It has a particular mechanism for achieving the UNFCCC notion of common but differentiated responsibilities, although it does it with an approach that I refer to as the QWERTY keyboard of climate policy, that is the distinction between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries. And most importantly, it's passed a political litmus test. It came into force. So those are all positives about the Kyoto Protocol. But, so some people, perhaps some in this room, would say the Kyoto Protocol was a good first step. Others, including me, would say it was not a good first step. But something in which we would all agree, since it essentially sunsets in 2012, is that a second step is required. And so I'm going to end the negative comments and be positive and smile and talk about going forward and think about the next step. And I'm going to be drawing upon the work of the Harvard Project on International Climate Agreements, which I direct. It's a international, multi-year, multi-sectoral, and multidisciplinary effort to help the negotiating teams, that's who we work with, the negotiating teams of the world, identify the key design elements of a post-Kyoto international framework, whether it's under the UNFCCC, under the Major Economies Forum, or a set of bilaterals. We're agnostic on that. And an agreement or arrangement that's scientifically sound, by which we mean it's consistent essentially with the most recent work of the IPCC, on which I served and have for 2 decades, that it's economically rational, by which we mean that it's essentially cost effective, that you couldn't do it a lot cheaper than the way it's being done, and that therefore it's politically pragmatic, by which we mean that the US Senate can and will ratify the agreement, and that China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, South Africa, South Korea, the key rapidly growing developing countries, will participate in increasingly meaningful ways over time. We draw upon research and ideas from leading thinkers around the world, from academia, economics, and other disciplines, mainly social sciences, private industry, NGOs, and governments. The reason we do is that although this is called the Harvard Project, my strong view is that no single institution, no sector, no discipline, no God knows no country has cornered the market on wisdom in this area. I'm learning every day when I'm around the world working on this issue. I was in Brussels a few days ago, at Yale 3 days ago, and in Washington the day before that. So we're always learning, and that's why this is as broadly based as it is. And by the way, I'll mention now, in case I forget, that if you're interested in getting plugged in or learning about new discussion papers and new work and new events as we hold them or release them, give me a business card afterwards or your email address on a slip of paper, and I'll be happy to put you on board to that. So we have 35 research initiatives in Europe, the United States, China, India, Japan, and Australia. And we're engaged in outreach work with governments and NGOs and business leaders around the world. We work with heads of state and heads of government and ministers in many countries. Just one example, we were commissioned, actually Harvard College, the president and fellows have signed a contract with Prime Minister Rasmussen of Denmark, and we serve as technical consultants to the Prime Minister in his role as president of COP15 in Copenhagen this December. But that's one of many such engagements. As was mentioned, we just released, or actually Cambridge University Press just published, a summary for policymakers. The full book is 1,000 pages. It's coming out in a few weeks. They decided it was a good idea, just like they do with the IPCC reports, which they also publish, put out a summary for policymakers. It has in it key principles for a new international agreement. I'm not going to take time to talk about that, but I think it's very important because I think it's practically what could be accomplished in Copenhagen as principles. Secondly, global climate policy architectures. I'll say a few words about that. Key design issues and elements as well. So the Harvard Project does not endorse a single approach, both because of an institutional reason, namely we have the word Harvard at the very front of the name of this project, and Harvard University does not take policy positions on any matters of public policy, with one exception, and those are public policies that directly affect higher education. So we don't take a policy approach, a single one. We are rather functioning as a living, breathing reference library, because different policy architectures will look good or bad to different countries, and fundamentally the choices are ultimately political, and so are far above my pay scale. I'm going to say a few words about architecture, but because of time I won't get into detail. The different architectures, in other words, the different designs for a future international agreement, fall under 3 categories. Targets and timetables is the first category. That's the most familiar category because the Kyoto Protocol is an example of that. So individual countries get targets. They could be numeric quantity targets, as in the protocol or not, and a timetable of action to deal with them. So that's what Kyoto is. Countries of the world have targets ranging from slight increase in emissions to emissions reductions on the order of 8% over a 5-year period. One of the approaches, which I'll mention but won't go into, is a very interesting one, which is within the targets and timetables approach. However, it addresses the perceived problems with the Kyoto Protocol and improves upon it. It's by Professor Jeffrey Frankel, a colleague of mine here at Harvard. Jeff is actually speaking at the workshop tomorrow, and that's exactly what he's going to talk about in great detail. So I'm happy to give it a plug and an introduction, but I won't say more about it. A second potential category, and we've got dozens under each of these, is harmonized national policies. This is actually the way a lot of international agreements work, not only in the environmental area, but in lots of other areas. That is, they're not really top-down to the extreme. An example of a harmonized national policy in the climate realm, one that's interesting academically but politically irrelevant, would be each and every country putting upon itself a carbon tax of the same size and then keeping all of the revenue. Third, independent national policies. I'll say a word about these, mainly because it's the other extreme and it's sort of interesting that these are independent, loosely coordinated unilateral policies. Given that it's a global commons problem and a free rider problem exists, you'd think this is impossible to address it, but actually I think this may be a significant part of the evolving de facto, if not de jure, post-Kyoto architecture, and that work is by former student of mine, Judson Jaffe, who's now the Treasury Department, and myself. I mean, the bad news is that we've lost a lot of people from this project in the administration. I guess that's good news for the country, it's bad news for me personally, because it increases my workload. That's not your problem. So the second one, which I am not going to tell you about, it's interesting. Jeff's going to tell you all about it tomorrow. If you're not going to be at the workshop tomorrow, go to the website and download it. Formulas for emissions targets for all countries. It addresses both the necessity for progressivity in targets. It addresses also the fact that one does not want to reward countries that did not take action post-1990. For example, the United States for not ratifying. Canada, they took the moral high ground. They ratified, but they're simply not going to comply. They're going to miss their target by 35%. Also, the key developing countries for not having taken on targets. Third, an equalization factor. All countries of the world moving towards equal per capita emissions towards the end of the century. Putting in place that kind of structure, we've done the numerical simulations of that. Subject to some political constraints, no country should have to incur costs greater than 1% of GDP per year, because we think if it does, countries will drop out, the agreement will unravel. So this is is like all of our work intended to be politically practical and useful. But it also means that developing countries don't actually incur costs in the early years, given the structure of it, but it still prevents leakage, which is a huge issue in Europe and in the United States. Bottom line, every country can feel that it's doing its fair share, but no more. At the other extreme, linkage of national and regional tradable permit systems. Remember, I'm just giving you two examples. I'm not pushing these two, but just giving them to give you a flavor. This is based upon the reality that whether you like cap and trade systems or not, this is on the positive political reality, that these are emerging as the preferred instrument throughout the industrialized world. Obviously, the world's largest system, the European Union emissions trading scheme, is in place. It had some problems, anticipated problems. Its pilot phase is working fine. In its actual Kyoto phase, the United States in 2010, perhaps 2011, will have an upstream economy-wide cap and trade system on CO2 and possibly other greenhouse gases. Australia will in 11 months, New Zealand at the same time, Canada a few months after the United States, because they want to go the same route as we do for obvious reasons of trade. And then finally, Japan has surprised all of us. For many years, Japan was pushing, this is even before the recent change of government, Japan had always argued for sectoral approaches, but is now going forward with cap and trade. Once you have these different cap and trade systems in place or planned, there is tremendous pressure both from the governments and from private industry, the complying firms, to link the programs together. And by linkage, I simply mean unilateral or bilateral recognition of allowances. You have a cap and trade system in Germany, I have one in the United States. You tell your firms they can use German allowances or US allowances, I say the same. That's bilateral linkage. The reason there's so much pressure to do that is it lowers costs overall. If our allowance prices were different to start with, it lowers costs overall. It reduces market power of individual firms, and it reduces price volatility. So that's the good news. There's some bad news, though. And that is that certain design elements, when you link directly, automatically propagate from one system to another. To take a very important example, in the United States, we're likely to have a safety valve, a cap on cost in our cap and trade system, possibly even a price floor in the Senate legislation. Europe is very opposed to a safety valve for its cap and trade system. If we directly link, you know what, they have our safety valve the next day. It is part and parcel of their system. So the question is, do you have your cake and eat it too? And that's what's interesting. And this is what's actually emerging, because each and every one of these cap and trade systems allows, to some extent, offsets from a common emission reduction credit system, not a cap and trade system, called the Clean Development Mechanism. Once they do that, then as long as that CDM is sufficiently large in market size, which is why reforming and improving the CDM is part of our work, then the individual cap and trade systems become indirectly linked. The allowance prices converge in those systems. You get the cost savings, you get the reduced market power, you get the reduced price volatility, but you don't get that propagation of those design elements. And so you don't have to harmonize the systems in advance. Interestingly, this is actually happening. So without anyone having decided up above, I don't want to sound like a right-winger, but without anyone having decided up above what should happen, because each of these jurisdictions is putting a cap and trade system in place, and it's in their interest to link with others, and it's in their interest to allow offsets from the CDM, they're going to become indirectly linked, which is why I would say that if it turns out the countries of the world don't get their act together in time in terms of a post-Kyoto regime, it's not as if there's a black box. What there will be, and what there are tremendous political pressures to maintain, is going to be a system of linkage, which is why I refer to this as the possible de facto, if not de jure, post-Kyoto policy architecture.
Invisible hand?
Now, because of time, I'm not going to go into detail on U.S. climate policy. Instead, I think what I will do, let me flip through, is just to say, let's see, let me say a couple of words, is that there is meaningful legislation in the Congress, and the House of Representatives voted out a Waxman-Markey bill. This is 83% reduction below 2005 levels of emissions by 2050, so it's quite meaningful. It passed the House by a small margin, much smaller than the margin of Democrats to Republicans. There is legislation now introduced in the Senate just a few weeks ago, but the politics in the Senate are very difficult, because the Senate rules, in order to close off debate, mean you have to have 60 of 100 votes, not a simple majority, and there is bipartisan opposition. There's opposition for Democrats from rural states and from coal states. That's largely the Midwest and the Middle Atlantic states. So the politics of this are very difficult. There are a whole set of substantive issues that I'm involved in working on. The most interesting one for an international gathering like this are the international competition protection measures. But again, because of time, I won't talk about those. If you're interested, we can talk about it in Q&A. There are other important climate policy developments in the U.S., some of which are good news, some of which are bad news. There is lots of discussion about carbon taxes. Most of that discussion is academic papers in academia. That's the real interest. There's also some phony interest. The phony interest is that precisely those firms who are most opposed to climate policy action have come out against cap and trade and in favor of carbon tax. Because of course they know once you begin to discuss things in terms of a carbon tax, you're going to have a much less ambitious program, if any at all. There's also the stimulus package, which in this country, as in countries in Europe, was green to some degree. However, the White House and the various departments and agencies are having a hard time spending the $80 billion on renewable and energy efficiency fast enough. There's an another track that's very important, and that's the judicial track in the United States. We are moving towards court-ordered regulation under the Clean Air Act. Regulating CO2 is what we would think of as a conventional air pollutant because of impacts on human health. Putting aside the details, there was a U.S. Supreme Court decision. The Obama administration moved forward by saying that CO2 endangers human health, and they did it by saying it increases temperature, which therefore makes human beings more susceptible to the risks of SO2, NOx, lead, all the conventional pollutants. So it's sort of an indirect, but that's the route they did. The problem, from my perspective, looking at this as an economist, is that the regulation would be ineffective. Just the nature of uniform performance standards and technology standards will be ineffective for the problem, accomplish very little, and be very costly. Worse yet, it'll be counterproductive because it'll play into the hands of those who oppose any climate policy action in the United States, the far right, the climate skeptics, because you're going to start to see policies that are ineffective, trying to regulate small sources, indeed family-owned, smaller business, what you're doing with your barbecue and grill in the backyard and your lawnmower, all of that, and that plays into the hands of the right wing opposed to climate policy. So in my humble opinion, as I said there, although I know I don't sound very humble, I'm sorry, that it would be terrible policy. The administration knows this. The White House has a marvelous team. Half of the environment people there are my former students, so I think they're a great team. But they want to go forward with this because they want to force the hand of Congress. That's the whole idea. We'll force the hand of Congress. My view is that if I want to convince you to do something, pointing a gun at my foot and saying I'm going to shoot myself in the foot if you don't do what I say is not a wise strategy on my part. It's a risky strategy. So I am personally not supportive of that approach, which has been there since the transition period, but that's the approach that's going forward. There's also another legal track with some public nuisance lawsuits under common tort law. Let's put that aside. And then the president at the G20 in Pittsburgh brought up fossil fuel subsidies. Now, just to link this with what I was talking, my real focus here, which is international policy, I would summarize the domestic part to say that there are positive policy developments in the United States. They're very significant, and they're going to continue, but the timing is a real challenge for the international process. Even 24, 36 months ago, I was saying that it was going to be very difficult for the U.S. to be ready for Copenhagen, no matter what administration, which party was elected, because of the short amount of time from January 20th to December 1st. Also, of course, now we have global recession, and more important than that, actually, is going to be the lagging unemployment, which it appears we will have, as we usually do coming out of recessions. We're probably in positive GDP growth right now, will be certainly, I shouldn't say certainly, very likely by the first and second quarter of 2010, but unemployment will be hitting probably 10-point-something%. And that's what is the politically salient number, not this concept, really, which none of us feel, of GDP overall or on a per capita basis increasing. So the recession is a tremendous challenge to the politics. Also, there are other U.S. domestic priorities, both of the administration and of the Congress, as you probably know, in particular healthcare policy. If the administration scores a success on there, they build their human capital for climate policy, their political capital. If they fail, or is perceived to fail on healthcare policy, then they dissipate political capital and have a harder time. And there's also financial regulation, which many people in the administration want to see go before climate policy. Then there's the Senate deliberations, which I suggested have very difficult politics and very difficult numbers, and we've got the timing of COP15, Copenhagen, December 2009. So that means it's unlikely, it's not impossible, but it's unlikely that the U.S. is going to be ready with a identified, definite domestic policy which could match its international negotiating position by the time of COP15. The window may open either before then or not very long after then. It could be in January, it could be in February. We'll see Senate vote, conference committee, the president signing something. But the window also will close. And the reason the window, the political window of action will close is because of the U.S. midterm elections in 2010. Remember, for those of you who are not from the U.S., those midterm elections don't just mean 1/3 of the members of the Senate being up for re-election. It means every member of the House of Representatives being up for re-election. And the closer we get to that date, the possibilities of bipartisanship fall away because Republicans won't want Democrats to have success. And it also makes life much more difficult for those moderate Democrats from coal states, from rural areas, to support climate policy, which will have the effect of increasing energy costs. So that brings up the questions, what are the real U.S. options for Copenhagen and beyond? I'm actually less negative than many people on this because rather than going into details, because I'm out of time, let me just say, let me quote a cliche that's often described about the U.S. baseball season. So in Major League Baseball, there are 162 games. And when teams go into a losing streak in April, when the season starts, and someone gets interviewed, someone on the team inevitably says, well, you know, with baseball, unlike other sports, it's a marathon, not a sprint. Climate policy, a stock environmental problem, in which the current focus is stabilization by the year 2050 of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, scientifically, economically, politically, is a marathon, not a sprint. The date of Copenhagen is, in my view, an artificial imposed deadline that need not be perceived that way. Finally, let me close by trying to tie this together and just pose the question, what do we think about U.S. participation in an international agreement? What can we anticipate will happen? And I should start with the former Bush administration, the most recent administration before this one, which you might be surprised to find out actually did have a climate policy. In fact, you can still see it. If you go to the White House website, they maintain all the previous materials from earlier administrations, so you can find it there. And they had a plan which they announced in the Rose Garden. It was about a year into the first term of the Bush administration, which called for a slow stop and reverse of emissions. Now, from the perspective of economic analysis that's been done on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, all of the best economic analysis, with one exception, the Stern Review, for reasons that we can talk about if you like, but it's highly flawed, although Nick is a friend and someone I like. It fits this pattern: slow, stop, and reverse emissions. Don't try to turn them down tomorrow, particularly for developing countries. Slow the rate of increase, stop the rate of increase, and then begin to decrease emissions and bring them down. The reason is that we want to decrease emissions, but without unnecessarily rendering large parts of the capital stock prematurely obsolete. I don't want to tell you to have to junk your car tomorrow morning. However, I want to provide policies so that when you buy a new car, you'll buy a more energy efficient one. Likewise with your house. I don't want you to have to tear it down if it's a structure that you can't put insulations blown into the walls. More importantly, with regards to power plants. More importantly, with regards to commercial structures and the entire capital stock of a relevant country. So that's why essentially the economic analysis comes up with that cost-effective path to achieving whatever stabilization targets almost you want. What was needed for the Bush administration, what they didn't provide, was the stop and reverse. In other words, the dates and the targets. So, but they had the shape right, they just didn't have any numbers on the graph, which is actually not just a metaphor. That morning at the White House, there was a graph. I can't draw it here, but going up, coming down, and the vertical axis had emissions for the United States, and it had numbers. I think I can say this now. And the horizontal axis had specific years. And then the administration did what any administration would do, including this one. Now, they invited over their friends, their constituency from the Congress, which in that case was the Republicans from the U.S. Senate. And when it went live in the afternoon, when the president announced it, instead of having numbers on the horizontal and vertical axis, it just said emissions in time. So they had the shape right, but they missed the numbers. The plan also embraced in principle market-based instruments, such as cap-and-trade systems in theory, which is good, but they talked about doing it with voluntary programs. If voluntary programs won't work. If voluntary programs would work, we wouldn't be sitting in this room today talking about this. It would just be happening through the forces of corporate social responsibility and the like. Now, Bush criticized the Kyoto Protocol as highly flawed international approach, which you can see that I don't disagree with that at all. I think that that was a proper characterization. But of course, what they didn't do is to propose an alternative. They had a window of opportunity early on in which they could have proposed an alternative, mainly to our European allies, and work together. But they chose not to do that. Now, does everything change with President Obama in the White House? Well, focusing for the moment on the word everything, the answer is definitely no. And here you have to keep in mind that back in the summer of 1997, before 6 months before Kyoto, the Senate voted. The Senate that has to ratify an agreement with a 60-vote margin voted and said a sense of the Senate resolution, non-binding, Byrd-Hagel resolution, that do not send us. We will not ratify an agreement that does not include the key, large, rapidly growing developing countries taking on targets. And it listed them, the same set of countries I named earlier. They're actually in the resolution. And you might think that was the evil Republicans, voting for it, and also all the Democrats. They voted against it, but the vote, as you can see, was 95-0. And that included both of our quite liberal senators, one now sadly deceased from the state of Massachusetts, Kennedy and Kerry. President Clinton did not submit the Kyoto Protocol to the Senate. In my view, Vice President Gore would not have had he been elected president, or as some of you would prefer to think of it, if the Supreme Court had validated the fact that he had been elected president. Nor would Senator Kerry. He said so when he ran for Bush for the second term. Kerry said Kyoto Protocol is flawed, and therefore I will not support it, but I'll work with other countries, he said, to develop a new and better international agreement. Likewise, President Obama will not agree to a Kyoto Protocol-style scheme, by which I mean without meaningful role for those key developing countries. That's a political reality. In other words, no matter who occupies the White House, Democrat or Republican in this country, An agreement that does not include those countries is simply not going to be ratified and doesn't have much of a future. But do some things, emphasize the word some, do some things change with President Obama in the White House? And the answer is absolutely yes. The change on this as other issues, but particularly the change on this issue of the current administration from the previous administration, the degree of the change could not be overemphasized. Whether or not that justifies the Nobel Peace Prize without any accomplishments in place is another question I'll leave to our Norwegian colleagues. But the change is dramatic, and there's a fantastic team on board in the White House and the administration working. There are state level and regional initiatives that will continue to advance. There will, as I suggested, quite possibly be a national cap and trade system in place by the end of 2010, maybe long before then. And this administration is working hard with other nations on a better international agreement under the UN FCCC, through the COPs, through the Major Economies Forum, and through bilateral negotiations, including important bilateral discussions with China. I apologize for having flown through that as I did, so I'll just tell you, for more information for what I talked about and for what I didn't talk about, here are some websites: the Harvard Project on International Climate Agreements. If you want more information about U.S. cap and trade systems, that's some work I did for Brookings. The Harvard Environmental Economics Program, a university-wide program I direct here at the university. And then, like all academics, including my colleague from Germany, like all academics, everything that I've written since I was in kindergarten is available as a PDF file on my website. So there is my website, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for this presentation. I should also mention that Professor Stavins has entertains a blog, the latest entry of which deals with economic instruments in the U.S. situation. So the takeaway metaphor is with baseball, which is probably a bit scary given the season of the Red Sox, but that's another element. We have quite some time for Q&A, so please identify yourselves and speak loud so we can hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
Reg McKean, Howard Institute for Learning and Retirement. I wonder if we could have tie the two talks together. Forgive my technological illiteracy, but I wonder if the carbon budget approach suggested by Claus is a form of cap and trade, or if there's any relationship. I'd also wonder if Professor Stavins would comment on the first talk, and let me go out on a limb in a second question and wonder if is it possible that the shock that might solve this problem technologically, the technological development that might resolve this problem successfully, would be some kind of scientific development that would completely destroy the climate skeptics, some kind of scientific advance. Thank you.
That's a broad question, so maybe you can answer it, and then we'll...
Okay. I'll be very quick on the first. In terms of my comments on the first talk, I haven't read the material, and I also foolishly did not move to a place in the audience so that I could see the slides, and hence I'm going to pass on making superficial comments on work that is, I'm sure, very profound and involved a lot of time. Having said that, on the second question, is there something that would happen scientifically that would prompt tremendous action? And this is an interesting one, because at least in this country, I don't know about other countries, but at least in this country, the way we've gotten the ambitious environmental regulation we have, and the U.S. has environmental regulation as or more ambitious than every country in the world, if you measure it by any appropriate measure in all the other areas. The way we've always gotten it is by there being some observed catastrophe or disaster. I mean, if we had time, I'd tell you the story about the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, RCRA, Superfund. Each of those are linked with something. But, you know, when the Cuyahoga River caught on fire in 1972, which is what gave us the Clean Water Act 6 months later, when it caught on fire as a result of, obviously, petroleum and chemical deposits on the surface, it's not as if the next day in the newspaper, in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, there were stories that said, well, you know, rivers catch on fire periodically for natural causes, natural reasons, because, you know, we know that's not the case. But with climate change, even if the most strident predictions, so I'm now taking the upper bound of the 95% confidence interval from the IPCC simulations from AR4, even if those turn out to be valid, then 30 years from now, that really hot day and whatever the precipitation impacts of it are, which are more important, for Cambridge, Massachusetts, will well be within the realm of not only what I experienced in my lifetime, but my father and indeed my grandfather. And the reason for that is that the climate change, even the severe climate change we talk about, which is this line going up like this, that's the climate, it's got something else, which is the weather. And the weather looks like that. Okay? So the climate is just the average of the weather. It's the, right? And the weather is the stochastic realization of that process. You and I and the general population do not observe the climate. We observe the weather. And that's why I would say that we cannot depend upon that bottom-up, sort of, you know, what in the U.S. has been sort of the bottom-up, whether it was for the right reason or the wrong reason, by the way, demand for public policy on climate change. Now, you might answer to that, well, wait, there's going to be a melting of the South Polar ice cap, or we're going to have methane releases from the tundra in Alaska as a result of melting of the permafrost. And then you're going to have what scientists refer to as sudden climate change, by which, by the way, they mean decades. They don't mean like that movie of a few years ago that's within 12 hours. But there's a sense in which that's too late. And so what does that tell me? Well, that tells me that for this country, don't rely upon the mechanism that has worked politically in the past. Rather, it's going to require inspired political leadership from the highest levels that's taking a chance, because it's going to be trying to sell something to the American population which they don't observe, which is why, as you may know, President Obama and his team no longer talk about climate change. You don't find the word climate change, just like now you won't find the phrase cap and trade, because those don't resonate. So instead it's going to be clean energy jobs. Now, that may be misleading, as I think it is, by the way, but nevertheless, that politically is what apparently will work.
Yeah, let me add just two brief remarks. One is, I think, the main difference, or even probably contradiction, between the budget approach and the system that was proposed here is that it looks over-regulated from an American perspective. It would need some international regulation. It would need a World Climate Bank or something like that to control and to monitor the process, and I think this is very much against the whole intuition of the American politics in general. The other point is, I agree very much with we cannot see, we cannot feel, we cannot touch climate change, etc. It has a different aspect of popular mobilization than it. For example, here's the European case, the mobilization against nuclear power, which was also could not the effects of probable or even having catastrophes in nuclear plants wasn't seen either after Chernobyl in '86, but here you had a broad political movement. And I think the intuition of politicians in Europe is, if ever they are in favor of the increase of renewable energy, etc., they would mainly focus on a negative mobilization against nuclear power. And they have now this fight, with countries like Sweden or the UK, which are very much in favor of, establishing nuclear power, and with France too. They would not chose a strategy in kind of mobilizing the public by the possible positive effects of climate change action in terms of changing lifestyles, changing consumer patterns, and all this. In terms of if ever climate change wouldn't even happen, it would be nice to have political action in terms of changing lifestyles, consumer patterns, etc. I think the most interesting aspect of that is the generational aspect. I think that particularly in Central Europe, difference of interests or even fights between generations are the most effective trigger for political mobilization. And I think if it becomes clear to the next next generation that climate change harms their perspectives in terms of welfare and economic growth, etc., etc., and their life chances, then this will become a broad issue, and then this will be also very much raised bottom up. For now, it's the same situation. We cannot see, we cannot touch. If we're talking about the weather, and everybody tells, well, you know, it's fantastic to have wine grown in another part of Germany. Why not? There can even Bordeaux wines can be exported to Germany. So we have all this. Yeah, these are my answers to that question.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Janet Farrell, Program and Negotiation, Harvard Law School, and Dispute Resolution Forum, UN Economic and Social Council. There's a certain feeling I get. It's a sort of Nero-like feeling that we're fiddling while Rome is burning. I mean, do you think that it would be better to take a wider top-down approach? What is it we hope to achieve? We hope to survive. We need a large, clean, safe source of energy. Why don't we start cooperating on that now? Let's determine what we have, not what we hope for, which is some kind of storage for solar, ground solar power, or fusion that hasn't worked for 40 years. What do we have that maybe might work, that would have a dual use? And shall we start? I mean, there's this overwhelming sense that we're that we're kind of paralyzed because we can't face the reality that people in Vanuatu, or not just in the Solomon Islands, are standing in water up to their knees 6 months of the year, and this is just, these are the Canaries, and just, what does everybody think about this?
Well, I disagree strongly with the notion that we're fiddling while Rome is burning. I mean, you've described what you think are some pretty serious consequences of this, but I'd ask you, what's your feeling about the fact that there are 2 other environmental problems, each of which are going to lead to the death of 7.5 million children next year? You don't, maybe you are exercised about those, I don't know, but you know, that's a result of lack of potable water supplies in developing countries, 7 to 8 million people. Next year, not 50 years from now, next year, indoor cooking fires in developing countries. Next year, 8 to 10 million women and children dying in developing countries of things that we know how to address. So if you put these problems, those are just the environmental problems, let alone all the other problems that the world faces. If you put all those problems on scale, I don't see that we are fiddling while Rome is burning. Rather, on the contrary, my view, the fact that it now appears so difficult going into Copenhagen is good news. So I am very bullish on this, and the reason that I am is that it would be easy to get an agreement in Copenhagen that's meaningless. It would be very easy to do an agreement in Copenhagen that's like the Kyoto Protocol, that only includes the industrialized countries, and which the United States will not ratify. Everyone, at least that's involved in the negotiations, agrees with that. That could be done, but that would be meaningless. But the fact is, the countries of the world now are taking the problem seriously. Therefore, they wanted an agreement that will bring in those key developing countries that have to be in, because the OECD countries could reduce their emissions to 0. I didn't say cut them by 50% or 90%, reduce them to 0, and we still couldn't achieve the 450 parts per million, for example, without China and India, let alone the other developing countries reducing emissions severely. Those are the numbers. That's the reality. So what was happening, the metaphor I have in my mind, is that for years what we were doing is we talked about getting to the other side of the mountain. What we did is we ran back and forth. We said, oh, we got to get to the other side of the mountain. We ran back and forth. We must be doing something good because we're sure getting tired. We're running back and forth. Now what people are doing is they're digging a tunnel in the mountain. And some people look at it and they say, oh my God, it's getting darker. That's right. It is getting darker. It is getting more difficult because the countries of the world are trying to do something meaningful. To accomplish what you would like to see, what many people would like to see, including these lifestyle changes, there is only, in my opinion, one approach that is going to bring that about, and that is using the price system. That is relative prices, because the use of energy, let alone the other greenhouse gases, is so ubiquitous in a modern economy. The only way of sending signals for those tremendous changes, not just in lifestyle, in dispatch, in new investment, in plant and equipment, for all the firms, for your house, for mine, for the new cars, the only way is going to be through relative prices, essentially pricing properly, in economic terms, the 3 fossil fuels, coal, petroleum, and natural gas, versus non-carbon sources of energy. It can be done in lots of ways. It doesn't have to be through a carbon tax. It doesn't have to be through cap and trade. But that force of using the price system in modern economies is essential. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary.
Well, I would agree and disagree. I would say, yes, it's true that cost effective is one of the main triggers for this action. That's why the whole budget approach is based on exactly that kind of rationale. On the other hand, people are also involved in what even economists call, behavioral economists call, a certain involvement in a larger goal. So you're not just heading for cost effectiveness. For example, if you put some insulation into your house, you also want to be part of something bigger. So you want to be, and this is what is hard to count. It's hard to count for economists, but very easy to account for
Or the cost benefit of survival, for example.
Yes, for example, exactly. And that's why I chose the AOSIS perspective. We would simply take over the perspective of those countries, those 15 countries. The whole discussion would be different, because then the time span would be very different. I completely agree that there are different approaches, and I understand the policy problems for the Obama administration, which is, by the way, true for most European regimes too. So there's no difference at all. I'm not, blaming the U.S. or praising European governments. What I do is that we simply should not neglect the aspect of leadership for Copenhagen. We will have a suboptimal agreement there, and you say it's fine because we will start the procedure again, the whole process starts again. We will meet half a year later in wherever, Bonn, Bangkok, Bali, Paris, hope it's Paris. But anyhow, we simply postpone, and all the ideas and cost effectiveness, they are simply, blocked by a couple of natural restraints and boundaries that come closer and closer, and then we cannot neglect the fact that time span is, the window of opportunity is closing. There's one moment when it's simply closing, and this, of course, must be approached with a very pragmatic, based on everyday reasoning. But anyhow, it's quite difficult to postpone. And here, some, even symbolic, leadership of Obama, Merkel, and others in regard to Copenhagen would not just be bullshit or rhetoric. It will be very, very important to keep this process going.
Well, symbolic action sometimes, symbolic action is sometimes valuable. Symbolic action also makes people think that something is being accomplished when it's not.
So A.
Pardon me?
Symbolic action A. That's what I was talking about, not B.
So my view is not on the basis of cost effectiveness in terms of using price mechanisms, but that nothing else can do it. You're not going to be able to accomplish it. And all the references to, the sort of the kumbaya slogans about we really have to address this all together, we've got to do it, it's in the ethical interest of mankind, that's effective at Harvard. That's effective in Berkeley, California. But you know that 99% of the populations do not exist in the elite institutions and the university communities of the United States and Europe. We're talking about the populations at large. We're talking about the people of low income that are aspiring to a higher standard of living of Central and Eastern Europe, of Southern Europe, of the developing world, of the Central United States. And that's why I say something needs to be done, but I want to be rational about it, practical about it, to accomplish something, instead of running back and forth on one side of the mountain, start to dig a tunnel to get to the other side.
I also want to be rational and pragmatic, but I disagree in regards to, the population in general, don't take me for an authoritarian person, it doesn't matter. What matters is strategic groups in the population, and there, at least in Europe, and I very much see that in California and other states, in the US too, and Massachusetts included, that strategic actors and consumers and groups and NGOs act on the same level. And if we are not including these people, fragments of the population, but not just trivial, banal parts of population, the whole thing will fail. Even the US will not make it just by a technological jump or a kind of perfect cap and trade system in the United States. needs the participation, the civic participation. It needs political mobilization. If not, I cannot see how we should keep a timetable.
Look, I'm a bi-coastal elitist myself. I used to live in California, now I live in Massachusetts.
Yeah,
but
the
look
only
at
place
the
I
look
know.
at the two states you mentioned, and the two states that Europeans always like to talk about. There are no two states that are less representative of the United States in almost every demographic characteristic that's relevant for climate change policy and raising the cost of energy than California and Massachusetts.
I have a much higher opinion of your country. We met.
It's not high or low, it's real. It's the reality.
No, but there was a transatlantic climate dialogue in Berlin,
I know.
organized by Foreign Minister Steinmeier and people from Wisconsin, or even the mayor of a place in Mississippi, I forgot, sorry, gave some hope. No, it's not true that there is just two states and there is just in Germany Freiburg and Tübingen, two university cities who really stick to that. No, it's not true. It's kind of reaching out large proportions of consumers and voters and citizens. I'm not so skeptic about that.
Okay, thank you very much for the question that triggered a lively discussion among our speakers, but I think we can take some more questions. You had a question? You had a question?
Yes, Maria Ivanova. I'm directing the Global Environmental Governance Project at Yale, and I'm faculty at the College of William and Mary. I have to comment a little bit on the discussion first, very briefly. I think actually California is perhaps the most important state in the U.S. If you look at it historically and what it has done for U.S. environmental policy over the years, and even today, energy consumption in California is half of what it is in every other state, because California took concrete policies in 1978 that left the energy consumption at the same level as in the 70s, while the state's population grew and the GDP grew dramatically. But it was through a combination of regulation and market that California managed to stay the most environmentally concerned state that has worked both with prices and with leadership, kind of both of the strategies that you proposed. My questions are, I have one question for Professor Leggewie. To explain in a little bit more detail what you mean by a World Climate Bank, and why are you calling it a World Climate Bank rather than a World Climate Organization? What's in a name and what's behind that in the concept? And then for Professor Stavins, the United States will be absolutely critical to any global agreement, whether it's in Copenhagen or beyond. And what, in your view, determines U.S. international environmental policy? In other words, when does the U.S. play along internationally? And then, secondly, what kind of agreement will the U.S. either agree to or even better propose as an alternative? What would be an alternative to what's currently on the table that the U.S. would like to champion?
Well, first question, why do we call it a bank? This was kind of introduced by an economist in Germany, Ottmar Edelhoff, who is also working for the IPCC, etc., and has worked a lot about this idea of a World Climate Bank, and this was kind of introduced in our report. I'm quite not very ambitious about the term. I think it is called a bank because it works like a bank. It should work like a bank. It should act as a bank and not as an organization. On the other hand, it fits into the scheme, you know, the Washington scheme of World Bank, International Monetary Fund, on a very different level. I think it's not that important how you call it. It's more important how it works. And maybe in tomorrow's workshop we can elaborate a little bit on this, because this is, of course, it's the weakest point in our proposal, and this needs, of course, not just a normative or rhetorical or argumentative clarification. It also needs a lot of political effort to construct such a thing like a World Climate Bank. And if you look at the flaws and deficits of World Bank and other institutions, of course, we have to learn a lot. It was, in a way, a kind of compromise, you know, for those people who argue very much in favor of kind of a world government, governance, global governance in terms of climate, and others who would stick to economic instruments, and that's a kind of compromise formula.
So I was at Yale on Friday speaking at the Yale Energy and Climate Institute. Were you at that presentation?
Yeah, I'm currently at the Woodrow Wilson
Oh,
Center.
okay, because then maybe afterwards, because I spent a lot of time in California working at AB 32, so I'm not sure my perception is the same as yours. We can discuss that afterwards. In terms of your questions about the about the administration, and that most of us in life tend to learn from our experiences, and we tend to learn particularly from our mistakes. We don't always learn rightly from our mistakes. We sometimes overcompensate. And something which is pervasive about this administration is learning from the mistakes, not its own. It's not been around long enough to make them, but from its predecessor, the Clinton administration, the previous Democratic administration. That explains this administration's position on healthcare policy very well, of leaving it up to Congress to go first. And it also explains its climate policy, because the perception of this administration, in my view, is very strongly that the Clinton administration made a mistake to go negotiate an international agreement that it knew it couldn't ratify and get through the Senate. And that's why this administration is leaving it up to the House and the Senate to go first, rather than developing legislation. They're just leaving it up to the Congress and go with that. And the reason, and this links with your international question, is that their view is that the way they can know what is politically feasible in the United States for compliance with an international agreement is whatever domestic climate legislation the Congress has put into place and the President has signed. So in this country, these are very much on a dual track, which our European allies, I mean, when I talk to people at Brussels and senior people in the governments, they're very aware of this and understand that it's very much a dual track between domestic policy and international policy. So there's a sense in which I can't tell you what are the numbers that the U.S. would approve internationally. It would be whatever numbers turn out to be in the time path out to 2050, such as right now it's the Waxman-Markey ones of an 80% reduction, that is enacted by the U.S. Congress, even though 60 votes is not the same as 67, which is what's required for ratification in the Senate. So that's the best answer I think one can give to what will be required. In terms of types of architectures, not the numbers, but how do we get there, that this government is open to. I mean, this sounds terribly self-serving, but it's really honest on my part. The best thing I do is get a copy of our book. And see it. So when the Major Economies Forum sat down to its first meeting, everyone had in front of them at the table a copy of our interim report. We're engaged. And I think that you'll see the variety of architectures, which may well be inclusive of the approach you're talking about. I don't know enough about it to say. Broad set of architectures. The keys would be, thank you. The keys, I'll give you the web address so you'll buy a copy of mine. The keys would be, as I suggested earlier, that number one, that the targets, at least for the U.S., were consistent with what was domestically feasible. That the key developing countries, that doesn't mean sub-Saharan Africa, it doesn't mean the poorer countries in Latin America or Asia, but those 5 or 6 key ones are taking on increasingly meaningful targets over time. That would be necessary. And I'm just telling, I'm not saying, this is not a normative statement on my part, I'm just telling you what I think would be necessary for them. And flexibility for the use of international carbon markets. Those are probably the key elements. And by the way, I think those are quite feasible, and we're going to see those elements.
Okay, thank you very much. We have time for a round of quick questions, so there was one here.
Moritz Hartmann, European University Institute and KBI Essen. Professor Leggewie, your presentation was very policy-based or orientated, but you also have some social implications. That was the game theory and its implications to climate change policy. Given the cultural dimension of social adaptation to climate change, why nation-states are hesitating, and why mankind is unwilling to change our economy, our emission behaviors.
Carsten Schneider, Center for European Studies visiting scholar. I enjoyed both talks and also the debate that involved. There was one thing that I thought was somehow missing. Both talks somehow presumed, the states are unitary actors, but I would like to believe that within states there will be winners and losers. And if you could just address who are the evil guys who prevent the US government, the European Union, to make further steps ahead. So I would like to believe these are the usual suspects, but probably you know more about that.
Do we have other questions, or are we going to take those two? So, Leggewie,
Concerning winners and losers, I'm no longer decided. If I look at, for example, the action of energy companies in Germany, for example, they really during the last 2 or 3 years they learned a lot, and it's not just lip service. They really learned a lot, and I think they really took up a lot of positions of what is discussed in the public, took up some ideas from former government, the Red Green government. They never, impeded the, oh my God, Energieeinspeisgesetz, the famous German law allowing, maybe someone can help me, allowing, the feeding of the energy web by, renewable energies, alternative energies, and you get even a fair price for that. They work with that, and they live with that, and they invest a lot in renewables and alternative energies. So there is a lot of resistance, more from traditional industries like steel, not so much coal, because they really look for CCS solutions which are completely impossible in Germany. There is a huge resistance against these kind of. So winners, losers, it's quite a differentiating picture. So I would hesitate to point to the usual suspects, which is very easy. And I would also give a prediction concerning, the outcome of our so-called right-wing government right now. For me, it's kind of Nixon in China solution. I think they will be much better than the Great Coalition before. So this is a bet, I'm the prognosis. The other aspect, the cultural aspects very much include, and we were discussing this in terms of how to evaluate consumers, citizens, in a general process, for reaching goals, targets that we are all agree upon. This is the difference, let's say, 2 or 3 years ago worldwide. I think there is this traditional view that a certain amount of knowledge leads into action, and I think this is completely wrong from psychological and cultural studies insights. I think it's just the other way around. If ever people act as strategic consumers, not just consuming less or for a better price cost effect, but thinking about the way they consume, I think this is the trigger for getting to terms with what climate change is about, what resources and nature might be. It's very unromantic. It's really learning like kids do. We all know how kids learn. They not just have some insight and then they act, and consequently they do it the other way around. They try things, they experiment. I think this is what's going on. And if we would simply create in our societies, which are strong and rich societies, a sense of experimentation and a sense of participation, this is the most important point. And here's really the disagreement between a lot of discussions in transatlantic dialogues, that we really focus on that, whereas our partners in the US and also in the UK really focus on technological advancement and economic incentives. I'm not against this. I would have had these 3 pillars, and I think it's very important.
So in terms of who the winners and losers are within countries, I think we can think about that in 2 ways. In terms of groups of consumers and then among sectors of private industry. With regards to consumers, the most straightforward answer to that is that low-income people. That's who's going to suffer. And that's because any climate policy, whether it's a carbon tax, a cap-and-trade system, or a regulatory policy, any approach is going to function, is going to ripple through the economy essentially as an energy tax to a large degree. Energy taxes, like any consumption tax, but energy particularly, are highly regressive because low-income people spend a much higher share of their income and wealth on energy. So in terms of, obviously we can go into vastly more detail from the analysis if you want afterwards, but that's sort of first order approximation. Among private industry, in terms of which sectors are particularly hit, assuming that not all countries in the world are taking action, and that certainly would appear to be for the time being will not be the case, then it's going to be essentially energy, the sectors which are both energy intensive and are subject to a tremendous amount of international trade competition. And who are those? I wrote down 6. Rolled steel, aluminum, cement, fossil fuels, glass, and paper. Those are the ones that have a much greater difficulty passing on the cost to their consumers of the regulation than firms in other industries who can simply pass on costs, which is why it then shows up in consumer bills. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. I'm trying to be honest about the costs.
But do they block negotiations? Are they actively involved?
So some of the ones that I mentioned, cement industry is very, very active both in Europe and in the United States in lobbying effort. Fossil fuel industry is very active. Aluminum industry is not in the United States only because we rely on hydroelectricity for a lot of the aluminum in the Northwest. Aluminum industry in other countries is very aggressive. And then in most countries, Australia and the United States stand out. I don't know about Germany, but certainly in Poland, the coal, domestic coal resources, because they will take a huge hit. I mean, if you want, again, if you wanted to look at a climate policy, it's basically a coal tax.
And they were very influential in, for these stimulus programs, in focusing on, say, it could have been much greener in Germany too.
They were also influential in recognizing the so-called carbon leakage in the EU climate energy package. Do we have another question, maybe? No, so everything's perfectly clear? Okay, so please join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you very much.